In June 1631, the sleepy coastal village of Baltimore, Ireland, was quiet. Most villagers were asleep: fishermen, farmers, families. Then suddenly, the silence shattered. Barbary pirates stormed the shore, armed with blades and muskets. They kicked in doors, dragged people from their beds, and bound them in chains. By the time the sun came up, over 100 men, women, and children were gone, taken across the sea, never to return. The youngest was just a toddler. This wasn't a one-time raid. It was part of a horrifying pattern that lasted for centuries. The kidnapping, snatched from home. The Barbary pirates, also known as corsairs, operated mainly from the North African ports of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Salé. Backed by powerful Islamic states, these pirates ruled the Mediterranean with fear from the 1500s to the early 1800s. But they didn't just attack ships, they raided entire towns. And they weren't just after gold or cargo, they were hunting people. Europeans, white Christians from coastal areas in Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and even as far north as Iceland, were prime targets. The pirates would sail for weeks, sometimes months, just to snatch fresh captives. Let that sink in. People from Iceland were kidnapped and sold into slavery in North Africa. That's over 2,000 miles. And this wasn't a few dozen here or there. Historians estimate that between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved by Barbary pirates over roughly 250 years. Think about that number for a second. Over 1 million lives gone. Families torn apart. Towns wiped off the map. So why don't we hear more about this? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Why do you think this part of history is rarely taught or talked about? Back to the raids. Imagine you're a fisherman living in a quiet coastal town in Spain. One evening you're mending your nets. The next, you're shackled on a pirate ship, sailing to a foreign land where you don't speak the language, and your only future is hard labor or worse. In 1627, Barbary pirates raided the Westman Islands of Iceland, kidnapping 400 people, a huge number for such a small, isolated place. These people were forced onto ships, taken to Algiers, and sold. Some were ransomed years later, but many simply vanished from history. And these attacks were often planned with insider help. Some pirates worked with European informants, spies, and even corrupt local officials. Money spoke louder than loyalty. Here's a chilling fact. In some coastal towns of Italy and Spain, people actually moved inland, abandoning fertile, trade-rich coastlines just to avoid the threat of being captured. Some areas remained empty for generations. Pirates even targeted large cities. In 1640, they attempted a raid near Naples, Italy. Locals barely fought them off. Even Venice, one of the most powerful cities at the time, had to fortify its shores. Have you ever thought about how different your life would be if you were born in the wrong village at the wrong time? It's wild to think about. Your hometown could be next, and nobody would come to save you. Now imagine this happening not once, but for centuries. A cycle of fear, kidnapping, and slavery. Generation after generation of Europeans grew up with the constant fear of the Barbary pirates. And yet, somehow, this brutal reality often gets overlooked when we talk about slavery or piracy. Why do you think that is? The auction block, human cattle. Once the captives arrived in North Africa, the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. After weeks at sea, packed into the filthy holds of pirate ships, half-starved and sick, the kidnapped Europeans were dragged off the ships and marched through the streets of Algiers, Tunis, or Tripoli. Locals gathered to watch the new arrivals. Some jeered, some stared in silence. And then the captives were taken to the markets. Not markets for food, not even for animals. Slave markets. And that's where the true humiliation began. Stripped of everything, names, clothes, dignity, the slaves were lined up like goods. Buyers poked and prodded them, checked their teeth, their muscles, their hands. Just like inspecting cattle. This wasn't hidden, it was public, normal, even celebrated. Men were sold based on their strength, age, and skills. Sailors fetched a high price. They could row the galleys. Carpenters, blacksmiths, builders, even more valuable. Women, especially young and attractive ones, were often separated immediately. Their fate was usually far worse. And the prices? A healthy European male slave might sell for 100 to 150 gold ducats. That was a fortune. But a beautiful European woman could go for double or triple, especially if she was blonde or fair-skinned, which was rare in North Africa and seen as exotic. Let that sink in. People were worth more based on their skin and hair color. What would you do if your daughter or sister was being sold in a place where no one spoke your language and no one thought she was even a person? Drop your thoughts in the comments. How would your community react if something like this happened today? The auctions were fast, brutal. Families were split up in seconds. A mother might be sold to a merchant in Tunis, her son to a galley captain in Tripoli, her daughter to a wealthy nobleman's harem in Algiers. They'd never see each other again. Some captives were even forced to parade through the streets to attract attention. Pirates knew the more dramatic the sale, the higher the bids. And sometimes, European captives were held not to be sold, but to ransom back to their home countries, if they could pay. That meant being locked in a dungeon or shackled in filthy holding pens for years, waiting and hoping that someone would send money. If you were rich or important, there was a chance. But if you were a farmer, a fisherman, or just a random villager, no one was coming. Here's a true story. In 1610, Miguel de Cervantes, the famous Spanish author of Don Quixote, was captured by Barbary pirates and held in Algiers for 5 years. His family finally scraped together a ransom, saving him. But he was one of the lucky ones. And then there were the horror stories. Some buyers weren't interested in labor. They were interested in cruelty. There are records of slaves being bought just to be tortured or used as entertainment in deadly games. One account tells of European boys forced into gladiator-style fights for their master's amusement. It's stomach-turning, but it's real. And if you're learning something new or feeling shocked right now, hit that like button. And subscribe if you want more of these hidden historical truths. We're just getting started. Now here's a question for you. What's worse, dying quickly in battle or being sold to the highest bidder, stripped of everything you are? Life as a slave, chains, labor, and worse, for those who weren't ransomed. Life as a Barbary slave was a waking nightmare. Forget the idea of slavery being just hard labor. This was punishment, torture, and survival rolled into one. Men were chained in groups, often with iron collars or shackles around their ankles. Their heads were shaved, their identities erased. Most were sent to work in brutal conditions, building fortresses, cleaning sewers, working salt pans, or quarrying stone under the blazing North African sun. But the worst assignment of all? Rowing the galleys. Slaves were chained to benches on massive pirate ships. No breaks, no mercy. Sometimes 3 men to a single oar, rowing day and night. If one collapsed, the others kept going. If someone died, they were left to rot until the next port, and you couldn't stop. The overseer stood above with a whip. Or worse. One escaped slave described it as being buried alive, without the mercy of death. Here's a real story. Thomas Pellow, a 12-year-old English boy, was captured in 1716 and spent 23 years in slavery. He was beaten, starved, and forced to convert to Islam. He wrote later that the only thing that kept him alive was the dream of seeing England again. When he finally escaped, no one even believed his story at first. It was too horrific to be real. And it wasn't just men who suffered. Women were often kept in harems, forced into sexual slavery. Some were given to wealthy merchants, rulers, or military leaders as gifts. Others were sold off to brothels. A few converted and rose in status, but most were trapped, used, abused, and discarded. Pregnancies happened. Children were born into slavery, and most of them would never even know where their mother came from or what her real name was. Some women were used as domestic slaves, cleaning, cooking, or raising the children of their captors. But even that wasn't safe. Abuse was common. punishment was swift. And escape? Nearly impossible. Ever heard of the phrase, out of sight, out of mind? That's how Europe treated its stolen people for decades. So here's a question. Do you think European governments did enough to stop this? Or did they just turn a blind eye because it was easier? Tell us what you think in the comments. We're listening. Some slaves tried to escape. Few succeeded. The North African terrain was harsh, the cities were foreign, and locals were often paid to return runaways. Punishment for trying, torture, branding, amputation, even crucifixion. Yes, crucifixion. Some pirates and rulers used it to make an example out of rebellious slaves. Imagine being nailed to a cross just for wanting to be free. And yet, in all this darkness, some fought back in their own way. Secret prayer groups, carvings on dungeon walls, passing messages in scraps of cloth. Even after everything was stripped away, some held on to their language, their memories, and their hope. And if this kind of raw, hidden history matters to you, make sure you've hit like and subscribe, because we're not done digging yet. It's easy to forget that these weren't just nameless victims. They were people, fathers, daughters, teachers, fishermen, lovers, lost to time, but not gone. So let's ask one more question here. If your ancestors were taken, would you want their story to be told or forgotten? Conversions and choices, Islam or death. For many slaves, there came a point when they were forced to make a decision: convert to Islam or keep suffering. Some were promised better treatment, others were threatened with death. Now ask yourself, would you switch your religion, your entire identity, just to stay alive? This was the reality for thousands of European captives. Refusing conversion often meant harder labor, fewer rations, or brutal punishment. But accepting it didn't guarantee freedom. In many cases, it just made survival slightly less painful. Some converted out of fear, others did it to stop the beatings or get a better job, and some did it to escape slavery altogether and joined the enemy. That's where things get dark. These people were called renegades, European slaves who converted and then joined the Barbary pirates. Some became guards, others rose through the ranks. A few even commanded pirate fleets. Here's one name you probably haven't heard: John Ward, an English sailor who turned renegade and became a feared pirate admiral in Tunis. After converting to Islam and changing his name to Yusuf Rice, he led attacks on European ships, growing rich off the very people he once called countrymen. Ward wasn't alone. Another example, Murat Rice the Younger, born Jan Jansoen in the Netherlands. Captured by pirates, he converted, rose to power, and eventually raided Iceland in 1627. Yes, Iceland, taking 400 people into slavery. Can you imagine that? Being kidnapped, switching sides, and then coming back to enslave others? What would drive someone to do that? Let us know in the comments. Was it survival, greed, or pure revenge? But not everyone who converted lost their humanity. Some used their new status to help fellow captives, smuggled food to them, passed notes, pleaded for mercy when no one else would. They walked a tightrope, pretending to be loyal while quietly resisting from within. Still, conversions were a gamble. A European who embraced Islam might get lighter work, maybe domestic labor instead of the galleys. They might be trusted more, even allowed to carry weapons. Some even married and had families. But they were still watched, still marked. And if they ever tried to escape, death. There are even records of public ceremonies where groups of captives were marched to a mosque and converted under pressure, with imams, guards, and rulers watching closely. These moments weren't spiritual. They were political, performative, a way to show dominance over the enemies of Islam. But let's be real, not all conversions were fake. Some captives truly believed in their new faith. After years in North Africa, they found comfort in it. Belief systems shifted. Identities changed. Others? They just said whatever it took to stop the pain. Here's the twist. Sometimes European captives pretended to convert, just to plan an escape. There are wild accounts of slaves secretly organizing revolts, stealing boats, or assassinating their masters to flee under cover of darkness. One man, a converted slave from Malta, helped free over 50 captives by faking loyalty for years. When he finally made it home, he was considered both a hero and a traitor, depending on who you asked. So what do you think? If you were in chains, starving, with no end in sight, would you convert? Would you play along? Or resist and die? Drop your answer in the comments. No judgment, just real talk. The Bastonado, pain from the ground up. If a slave disobeyed, tried to escape, or simply looked at a master the wrong way, punishment came fast and cruel. One of the most feared forms wasn't death. It wasn't branding. It was something much more specific and terrifying. The Bastonado. Have you heard of it? If not, prepare yourself. The Bastonado was a torture method used across the Ottoman Empire, and the Barbary states made it a standard punishment for slaves. Here's how it worked. The victim, usually a rebellious or disrespectful slave, was tied down, arms bound, legs lifted, and then the soles of their bare feet were beaten with sticks, rods, or heavy wooden clubs. It didn't sound as dramatic as a whip across the back, but it was far worse. Why? Because the soles of the feet are packed with nerves. Every blow sent fire shooting up the body, and the pain didn't stop when the beating ended. Many victims couldn't walk for days, some for weeks. In some cases, the damage was permanent. Imagine trying to escape when you can't even stand. One slave wrote that after a bastonado session, "Even the wind on my skin felt like knives." Others described their feet turning black, swelling so badly that the skin split open, and they still had to go back to work. Here's a recorded case from Algiers in the 18th century. A group of slaves were caught praying in secret. Their religion wasn't outlawed, but praying without permission was seen as defiance. All of them were bastonadoed in public, not whipped, not jailed, just laid out and beaten across the feet until they passed out. That was the message. You want to keep your soul? Fine. But you'll lose your body. And for those who resisted after that, the punishment escalated to amputations, eye gouging, or being thrown to rot in subterranean prisons, sometimes for years. No light, no air, no exit. So here's a real question. Why go to such lengths just to crush the human spirit? Control. Because if you make someone afraid to stand, they won't run. And if they won't run, you own them. Ransoms, rescue, and forgotten stories. Not every slave stayed forgotten in the dungeons of Algiers or the galleys of Tunis. Some were ransomed, some were rescued, and some took matters into their own hands. Let's talk about ransom, because for many European captives, it was the only hope. Families, churches, and entire communities back home would scrape together every coin they could find, hoping it was enough to bring someone home. There were even religious orders dedicated solely to rescuing slaves. The Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, Catholic monks, traveled across the Mediterranean raising funds and negotiating directly with pirate leaders. These weren't warriors. They were diplomats in robes, risking their lives in the heart of pirate territory. One Mercedarian monk, Father Pedro Armengol, was captured during negotiations and actually offered himself in place of another prisoner. That's how serious this was. Some people chose to stay enslaved so others could go free. Think about that level of sacrifice. Would you trade places with someone if it meant giving up your freedom? And when ransom wasn't possible, sometimes people bought their freedom through service, decades of obedience, or winning the favor of powerful masters. But even then, freedom didn't always mean safety. Many former slaves returned to Europe, only to face suspicion, poverty, or even accusations of treason, especially if they'd converted while in captivity. There were rescue missions too, but they were rare and risky. In 1815, the young United States Navy, led by Stephen Decatur, launched a daring mission to Algiers to stop American sailors from being taken. They bombarded the harbor and forced the Dey of Algiers to sign a treaty. It was one of the first times anyone had stood up to the Barbary states with firepower, and won. But by then, the damage had been done. Over 1 million Europeans had already been enslaved over the past 250 years, and for every Thomas Pellow who escaped and wrote a book. There were thousands of others whose names we'll never know. Entire villages were emptied, generations lost, and somehow history moved on without them. And here's the real question. Why don't we learn about this? Why do we know the names of Caribbean pirates, but not the victims of Barbary slavery? Let's be honest, it makes people uncomfortable. Because it doesn't fit the usual story of who enslaved who. Because it involves religion, race, power, silence. But that's exactly why it needs to be told. So tell us in the comments, had you heard about Barbary slavery before this video? Why do you think it's been left out of the history books? And if this story hit you, smash that like button and subscribe to History Dictionary. We bring the raw, untold truths of the past. No sugarcoating, no filters. Every name lost to those ships deserves to be remembered.